My name is Rick Fawn. I have the great privilege and pleasure of hosting this panel. I come from the University of St Andrews in Scotland. Perhaps somewhat removed, you might think, from Central Europe, but I can mention that in 1433, a Czech Hussite made his way to St Andrews. I'm afraid to say that because this was the birthplace of the Scottish Reformation, he came too early and he was burnt at the stake. But it's marked on a street in St Andrews. I'm also glad to say that another connection to Central Europe found itself with a much more favorable reception, and that was a little over 500 years later, when St Andrews was the home to the Polish Free Forces during the Second World War. Of course, not the political capital, but the military capital, which is commemorated by, among other things, a bust to General Sikorski. So the connections are certainly there, and it is my privilege to host this panel, which I think, interestingly, I will introduce with a collective introduction. You have the bios, we could draw your attention to that, but in our panel, our collective experience includes really decades of academic and policy study, but also experience that ranges from the first post-communist Czechoslovak parliament to the European Parliament, and our aim here is to look at the sense of values in foreign policy, Czech and Polish. We have 4 speakers. A slight unfortunate note to mention, which is that Leszek Jesen is unable due to illness to join us, although he very enthusiastically and helpfully sent many comments by email, which may filter into the conversation. But on my far left, that's not a political statement, that's just an orientation, Pavel Barša from the Institute of International Relations. On my immediate left, Jiří Schneider. On my right here, Konrad Szymański. And then finally, Břetislav Dančák. Our speakers will be asked to use about 8 minutes. I'm going to be fairly strict about that. We will open then to discussion, and of course we have a very strong showing from both Czech and Polish communities here, so we look forward to observations and comments. And then at the end, Břetislav will have a number of minutes to make a summation, perhaps both on the general discussion and comments from our presenters, who I will give a couple of minutes, should they want, it's not obligatory, should they want to pick up points themselves. So we will start in the order that we have on the program with Pavel. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. I will have 3 points which I want to develop here. First of all, I will try to contrast values and interests in foreign policy and also realism and idealism, and then to ask the question to what extent Czech foreign policy tradition was rather idealistic in its main thrust or realistic. And finally, I will ask some questions relating to the future. So, since the contrast between values and interests and idealism and realism comes from the time of Cardinal Richelieu, where it began to be clear that there is a tension between universal values pertaining to human beings, regardless of their membership in any political community, and on the other hand you have national interests, which sometimes requires statesmen to sacrifice some of those universalistic values. Cardinal Richelieu, for instance, he formulated the doctrine of raison d'etat, which states exactly that the main goal of the state is to survive, and sometimes there are some occasions where you have to sacrifice human lives and human principles and principles of morality to survive. Now, against which idealists formulate 2 principles at least. One which says that this difference between moral rules which are followed by ordinary men and moral rules moral rules which are formulated by statesmen is not valid. That even the statesmen should follow the rules, the same moral rules as normal, ordinary people. And the second tenet of idealism, which says that the goals of foreign policy cannot be reduced to national interests or sovereignty in themselves, that there must be something more to the goals of foreign policy than simply the values of national interests and national sovereignty. Now, let's look at Czech foreign tradition. Of course, we have to take into account only, relatively free times. So basically, the First Republic and the last 25 years. So we will skip the communist period, German protectorate, the Second and Third Republic. And if we do that, we will clearly see that the idealistic discourse has a clear predominance, and realism rather plays a role of reactive counterpoint. So both Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk and Václav Havel were idealists on those two accounts which I just mentioned. Both claimed that the rules of moral conduct at individual and state level should be the same. There should be no difference between them. And both said many times, repeatedly, that Czech statehood, Czech national sovereignty, national interest, is not the highest value. The Czech statehood has a higher purpose than itself. For them, the Czech statehood or sovereignty had sense only if it contributed to the humanistic transformation of the mankind. So, for Masaryk, for instance, if you read the word revolution, he states there that the foundation of the first Czechoslovak Republic is not the purpose in itself, but it's part of much larger process of progress in which democracy and humanism is vanquishing, defeating authoritarianism and barbarism. Similarly, Havel viewed the Velvet Revolution as a part of the global process of spreading of human rights and democracy. Moreover, both presidents were staunch Atlantists. They saw the United States as both incarnation of humanistic values, they endorsed, and as the geopolitical guarantor of the Czech sovereignty. Of course, Masaryk hopes for a strong involvement of the US in the global and European politics were dashed immediately after World War I by the isolationist turn in the US foreign policy. But Havel was more lucky because he became president in a unique world historic moment of American unipolarity. So he became an unconditional supporter of the global American hegemony, which he saw as the guarantee of the global spread of human rights and democracy. The central gravity of his arguments for support of all American military interventions since the early 90s until the end of his life, that is, from the first anti-Saddam war in 91 until NATO bombing in Libya in 2011, was moral. He always argued morally for those. So, for instance, one quote, which is very typical, I think. In June 1999, after the bombing campaign against Yugoslavia, he published in the New York Review of Books an article, the very title of which was unambiguously idealistic. The title read, Kosovo and the End of the Nation State. There he hailed the bombing of Yugoslavia as, quote, probably the first war that has not been waged in the name of national interest, but rather in the name of principles and values, unquote. Another example of his idealism was how he made his case for the American radar as part of American anti-missile defense shield on the Czech territory. He repeatedly said that he's not really interested in security consideration or geopolitical consequences. That's not really important, he always said. What's really important is what it would mean, what it would signify, what the radar would express. And what it would express, it was endorsement of our alliance with the US and of the values on which this alliance is based. Again, values and principles are in the forefront. Consequences of the choice is basically insignificant. Okay, the last part, how many minutes I have? Okay. The last part is the recent period. I will have to generalize a little bit, and it's schematic and simplified, but still I think until 2009 we can say that both left-wing and right-wing governments followed more or less Havel's Atlantist choices, even if they didn't usually use this extremely moralistic rhetoric, but they usually followed the political choices he endorsed. After Obama's term, to less interventionist policies on the global level, to more passive policy posture towards Europe, Czech Atlantists got disenchanted and in a way disoriented. It's no wonder. How can you continue to support global American hegemony if the main guy in the White House expresses doubts about it? So as I said, I mentioned that Havel was strongly supporting Libya, the NATO intervention in Libya. Nečas government didn't. Was neutral. So it's interesting. It's the first time that you could say that Havel diverged from the official choice of the Czech government. And Nečas government, even in its European policies, became much more focused on interest, national interest, than on values. As if they stress, you know, what we are interested in are really national interests of Czech Republic, not really values of European Union. Also, if you followed the Czech-American relations under Nečas government, it looked like it's not the values and spreading of democracy are not really the most important issue. At that time, the most important issue was Temelin, basically. The last words. I hope that, and we've heard the speech of our foreign minister, which to me at least looked hopeful in the sense that there is an overhaul of the Czech foreign policy, and it seemed that he wants to combine those two poles which we contrasted at the very beginning, namely human values, the value of human rights and democracy on the one hand, and national interest. And he claims, I think that's the future, and that's the task for the future, not to get stuck into those sterile dichotomies which are symbolized mostly by Havel on the one hand and Klaus, which would be the Czech embodiment of the realistic posture on the other, but to combine national interests and promotion of universal values, because in the Czech Republic our political tradition has at its core human values, universal human values like human rights and democracy. So of course the foreign policy has to be based on clear identification of particular national interests, but because we have this tradition and this identity, we have to combine those particular national interests with the care about human rights and democracy. Thank you.
Okay, Pavel, thank you very much indeed. Well, people are very inclined to give a round of applause very appropriately. Let's do that. If we could invite Jiří now to speak. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Pavel is a professor, and you may see the contrast between foreign minister speaking, actually underlining that you cannot apply schemes, whereas professors like schemes, and that's exactly what Pavel employed. I mean, it was very schematic. There is a value of this approach. You need schemes to actually approach the reality and to orient yourself. But in foreign policy, you are sometimes under time pressure. You have to employ the toolbox you have, and there is no time to reinvent and conceptualize. Sometimes you have to react. I have one problem with this review of foreign policy. It's always the problem doing a review of foreign policy and maintain the perception that you are continuing what you're supposed to do, what you're expected to do. So it's very difficult and I would say dangerous exercise to reinvent the ship while you are sailing. And that's exactly the situation of the diplomats. The ship is not in the dock. The situation is not calm. It's quite stormy, as the foreign minister has described the situation. So that's my caveat to this approach. But the debate is important because the situation is changing and we have to adapt to new realities. As for values, applying values in individual life or in foreign policy, most of the choices are not the choices between good and evil. The choices are between lesser evil and evil, a bigger evil. That's the choices you're doing, and it will be always like that. A couple of points on the topic. Values are a source of identity. I'm not speaking only about universal values, but there are some values which are basis of what some people call identity politics, which might be dangerous, but to a certain extent you formulate your national interest also with a respect to values, to traditions, to your predecessors. That's why we refer to Masaryk, Pavel. You've heard these names several times already. Czech foreign policy and also expectation of our partners about our policy is shaped by history. It's shaped by the key dates of our history. It's shaped by 1918, 1938, 1968, 1989. This is how our partners are expecting us to behave. These are the key elements of that. Smaller states cannot rely on realpolitik only. This is my basic thesis. Our position, our geographic position means that, and our experience is that if there was only realpolitik, we were always victims of that. We don't have the prerogatives of the realpolitik. I mean, what are the prerogatives of power? Do we have them? No. We don't have a big army, we don't have natural resources on our territory. I mean, you can name it. So we always enjoyed the periods of history where there was also idealistic element of in international relations. Of course, it was very important that the Central Powers in the big war, World War I, were defeated. That was realpolitik. But without Wilson's idealism, there would be no independent Czechoslovakia. And that's important to remind. A small footnote, sometimes there are questions about what is specific in the relations between Czechoslovakia and Czech Republic and Israel. I would argue that this is a very interesting case study. I used to be ambassador to Israel, so I could employ this for the whole lecture, but let me remind you that it was only natural for a state which was born out of the principle of self-determination to support a national Jewish state. But the result of the Czech foreign policy and supporting Israel, even militarily, was from various sources. It was Soviet realpolitik, because Soviet Union wanted Czechoslovakia to support a Jewish state which was assumed to be anti-British imperialism. But that was also from the idealistic sources, because the foreign minister was Masaryk Jr., and he was following in the footsteps of his father, supporting the ambitions of the Jewish nation. So I would very strongly argue that this distinction between idealistic and realistic is schematic. Moreover, I will make more distinctions between idealistic, which is trying to promote ideas based on reality, and ideological approach, which is not respecting reality. Also, I would make a distinction between realistic policy, respecting reality, and realpolitik. We should make this distinction. And I think it's very much in line of what Masaryk called realistic policy. He had a realistic party even. Now, we need, as a smaller state, international system and international organizations which embodies values, which in fact means it's rules-based. If there is an international system which is less based on rules, we are victims of it. This is the system in which the smaller states like Czech Republic can promote its interests. Much better than in the defense system. That's why we should care about the United Nations. United Nations, it's not only idealistic concept. It's based on the winning powers of the Second World War, which have a veto power, so it's not completely idealistic. But it has some principles, and there is Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which has been accepted by everyone. We have OSCE and Paris Charter of the post-Cold War principles, which has been questioned by President Putin recently. And this is a big change. We are standing on the side of Paris Charter and the Helsinki principles of coexistence in Europe. So our interest is to maintain these international institutions and to work to make them adaptive to the new circumstances. I already said the dichotomy of Atlanticist idealism and national sovereignist realism is quite schematic, and I would say it's a false dichotomy. I'll give you some counter-arguments to that. I would strongly argue that President Havel acted like realist, not idealist, when he was supporting Czech membership in NATO to safeguard national sovereignty of this state. I would, on the other hand, argue that Prime Minister and then President Klaus acted like ideologue and not a realist when torpedoing European integration. I don't see this realist policy. And you may name a couple of other examples. So my basic point is that, of course, we have to conceptualize in trying to, understand the principles and the schemes. But in the end, the foreign policy is based on the toolbox. If you are doing a foreign policy of this state like Czech Republic, you inherit a couple of tools, not much, not many, and you have to use them. A foreign minister referred to reputation. That's one of the tools. And you have to very much care about the reputation of the country, because this is a tool. If you have a reputation of a country which is pursuing some predictable goals, then it is a partner with which you can work, and you can achieve some goals. Of course, NATO and European Union are our basic anchors for national sovereignty, and I would argue that being anchored in these two institutions, we can afford more ambitious foreign foreign policy. Not less ambitious, but more ambitious, because we are not a lone player. Even more, we can co-shape the external policies of these two institutions. What is very valuable, and the foreign minister has mentioned it, this is incredible achievement, and we should do I would call it almost vital interest of this country, to maintain the neighborly relations we have, which are, you know, historically on the highest level ever. On this level, using these anchors, alliance and EU, which we enjoy with our neighbors. The Czech contribution to international community should be based, this ambitious foreign policy, on our humanistic tradition, which was referred to before, preference for liberal international order to power politics, and living up to best expectations that others have about our traditions. My argument about supporting human rights and fighting for freedom around the world is that it's not that we are applying a muster to pattern to others, but it's because the others are looking at us as an example of a successful transformation to the free country. This is the obligation we are having. It's not that we are trying to apply something to others, to impose others. It's on the contrary. There are people, and we can name examples, who are looking at the Czech Republic, quoting President Pavel as example, and saying, we would like to do similar things in our circumstances, what you did. Please help us. This is the obligations we have, and we shouldn't give up this obligation. Thank you very much.
Excellent, thank you very much. Konrad, please.
Thank you. It's good to start before my remarks will become even longer than they are right now. Listening to those interventions, I would like to stress one new thing. I don't believe that there is any definitive contradiction between values and interests. Of course, it would be good to put some attention to definitions before we talk about certain notions, but we have no time for this. This is not a philosophical seminary. I would just mark that interests are naturally related to improvement, at least, of security and welfare, and values are not so easy to define. I would agree with intervention of Minister at the very beginning that we have problems with these definitions. I would agree that it's very easy to say that we will want to defend values, but it would be good to say what values we want to defend and what kind of hierarchy of values we want to defend. It's not, maybe it's not esoteric, I would say. We are a little bit closer to the understanding of this, but it's not so easy. If it would be easy, the UN member states would never go to a war because they signed very clear, at least at the lexical level, very clear document about values. But there is no contradiction by definition between the values and interest. I would say even more that the wisdom of politics is to propose the harmony and the synergy between values and interest. Values are embodied, are incarnated in ourself, in our individuals, and also in our communities, also political entities. Without the political entities, without the communities, values doesn't exist, probably, or would be quite idealistic, quite theoretical phenomenon. It wouldn't be wise to put pure power on the altar without any moral limitations. That's pretty clear, and I think the awareness of this fact is very lively here in Central Europe because we suffered. We still remember what does it mean, pure power without moral limitations, because generations of people who suffered this system still alive are among us and they're a real witness. But it wouldn't be wise to say that the political entities exist only to fulfill any kind of Promethean mission to redeem any part of humankind or to change the humankind into a new era. It wouldn't be realistic. Without political entities, without political communities, our values doesn't exist, and the wisdom of politics is to harmonize them. Of course, according to the general perception, especially in Europe, our part of Europe is more idealistic, because we prefer this language. We use this language more frequently than our partners in Western Europe. That's true, and I think the reasons are historical. First of all, I already mentioned the witnesses of communism are still among us, and they know what they want to say if they try to remind us that values are important in politics, and there are borders for politics. Politics is not alone. But I think the reasons are much deeper. The first problem is that our countries are born from at least from the civil disobedience, sometimes from the revolution for the right to self-determination. We are somehow post-imperial part of Europe, and this is, to some degrees, this is our common experience. During the 19th century, when the modernity was formed in Europe, our nations mostly lived without own state. This is the main reason why we are more trustful to values than to institutional aspect of politics. And I think it's much deeper than we think. Of course, it leads us toward more understanding of very similar, I would say, Promethean messages we hear from Washington. Probably this is the reason, because U.S. is a country made by revolution as well, in completely different situation, but this is also a revolutionary, say, state. This is the reason probably why so many Europeans were so receptive for Promethean design from US, especially during the beginning of the 21st century. That was the surprise for many Western Europeans, why we are so receptive. That was not only a question of this shallow Atlanticism, that was something deeper in this. We hear the music which is always historically much more friendly to our ears. But also, we have to admit that we are still weaker partners in international relations. And the values, multilateralism, treaty-based policy is always a power of those who are powerless. That's natural. We can't believe in bilateral policy of the power play. We believe that the international order will be reformed into more value-based or treaty-based system. Of course, it could be misleading, because it could lead us toward too much idealistic designs or beliefs. I think that was the question of the 19th century. I don't want to develop it, but during the 19th century, for example, Poles were present in almost every revolution around the globe. From South America, of course, North America, of course, France, of course, Italy, of course, Hungary. Everywhere you can find some Polish generals, colonels, or thinkers. And this is not incidental. I think this is not very useful tradition today. We should embody that tradition into the institutions because we have our own state. But it's understandable that we want to use this state more carefully, and the pure power is not the only direction we want to follow. But this new realism, I would say after 25 years we can say that we are touching the problem of realism. This new realism could be misleading too. I would say that this realism could have very different names. First of all, it could be just a nostalgia for ancien regime, and I understand this way some aspects of this new realism toward Russia after the war in Ukraine. This is not only the question of the threat, this is not only a question of pure realism, this is also the question of nostalgia. The other problem is short-termism. I would say that well-defined values coincide with long-term interests. But if interests are defined in very short term, if they are very short-sighted, very narrowly defined, it could be misleading. And this is also the case with this new realism in our part of Europe. And the third aspect of this new realism, which I'm worried about, is of course misjudgment about the Russian politics. It would be very nice if Russia would be just another player in the world affairs who would like to develop trade and international relations without any specific demand or expectation from our part of Europe. It would be very good. I would dream about that kind of situation, but this is not the whole truth. The war in Ukraine is not a consequence of the social undevelopment, as we heard just theoretically a half an hour ago. This is not a question of social injustice. It is also the question of the imperial appetite. And we have to agree that people have many different demands, many different expectations, many different ambitions. And one ambition is, of course, social development and social justice and right to live and to develop. But the other things, the other aspect of our soul is also the imperial, for example, imperial appetites and imperial aspirations. Sometimes, though, imperial aspirations are a clear substitute for social development, which is not successful in some countries, including this one mentioned already. So, concluding, I wouldn't support and I wouldn't advise to look for definite contradictions between values and interests. It would be too easy to say this. The real challenge and our own challenge is to find a common ground for values and politics. Otherwise, we will lose, or we will conduct the policy on only one leg.
Okay, Konrad, thank you very much. You'll know that we started a few minutes late. We have permission to go into the coffee break somewhat. The next panel will firmly resume at 11:30. So can I invite some brief comments and questions? We'll then go back to the panel and then finally to our discussant. So if you could indicate an interest to speak briefly, please, that would be very helpful. Thank you. Can take hands. Okay. Any others? It's a very intriguing opportunity. I would make use of it. So please come.
All right, Michal Kozan from the Institute of International Relations. I don't want to steal the floor, but as I saw that not anyone was eager to speak at the beginning from the audience, I will use this opportunity. I would like to thank all the panelists for their excellent remarks, and I would like to turn to both Jiří Schneider and Pavel Barša, because on the surface I saw some kind of a disagreement between you. But when I get to the conclusions, and I don't want to misinterpret Pavel, especially your book Power and Reason in Politics, it seems to me that you in the end get to the same point, and basically arguing for especially strong multilateral international institutions and strong Czech involvement in those institutions, especially the UN and of course the others. So if you can just comment on that, because it's for me it's interesting point.
Ivan Gabal, thank you. I would like to ask Jiří Schneider to elaborate briefly on one issue he touched slightly, and this is his experience as a public servant in this building on interaction between administration and political level more broadly. Thank you. In just developing foreign policy.
Vladimir Handel, Institute of International Relations. I have a question to our speakers. Could you comment on the way how the political left and political conservative liberal parties dealt with the issues of national interest and values? Did you see fundamental differences there, or would you say it was rather mainstream sort of thinking, keeping or maintaining the continuity? Yeah, just this brief question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think some very insightful comments and questions from the floor. Can I suggest that we work our way down the panel, concluding with our discussant? Thank you.
To the first question, you're absolutely right. Basically, most of what was said by Jiří, I subscribe to. I have no problems with that. I think the only difference is that my idea now, at this point in time of Czech foreign policy, I would see, I think we have somehow to combine those two poles, as I said, which is what he said. So I am schematic exactly because I want to overcome the dichotomy, right? So I have no problems. The only thing which I am some reservations is that he actually stressed only when he said that there is a perverse idealism, which he calls ideological, right? And then perverse realism as realpolitik. And he mentioned only Václav Klaus, right? And I think we can look, so of course, again, it's scheme, right? You have two symbols. Václav Klaus as symbols of national interest and realism, Václav Havel as symbol of idealism and values, right? And he probably doesn't think that there was some problem in Václav Havel's realism, and I think there was. Exactly the quote I provided you with was pointing to that. I think it's really, you cannot really conduct foreign policy only on the basis of universal values. It's absurd. Foreign policy is about, and especially, if I can add further philosophical, if you allow to do, Jiří, distinction between the conduct based on principles and values and the conduct based on consequences. I think politician has to base his choices on consequences, not simply on the correspondence between the values and his act. So you see the horrible dictator like Saddam Hussein, you are of course indignant, you know, it's scandalous, and you say we have to overthrow the guy. This is basically like Havel, as Havel described his choice. He said, it's as if you see on the everyday level, and he was explicit about that. You find the passage in Havel when he says, you know, it's as if somebody was beating somebody else, somebody weaker, on the street, and you wouldn't intervene, right? So at the same time, you have to intervene if the dictator like this, you know, is doing such horrible things. This is only part of the source of foreign policy choice. The second part is that you have to ask, what will be the consequences of that? Will they be, and again, from the moral point of view, for the values who you value, worse or better? Will you cause more suffering by intervening? Or it's probably better not to intervene because you cannot really help, you cannot repair, you know, you cannot make the situation better than it is. So I think if Klaus's realism was many times perverted in his choices into realpolitik, Havel's idealism and his unconditional support of American hegemony, whatever costs, was ideological. Thank you.
May I follow up on that? Of course, it would be great if we would make a case study of the interventions and the support of interventionism. One remark to this. You said that Havel wanted intervention in Kosovo, American intervention in Kosovo. One has to take into account the desperation of European politicians vis-à-vis the suffering and war in Yugoslavia. If Europe would have been capable of intervening in Yugoslavia, we wouldn't need the United States to do that. We failed as Europeans in the 90s in doing so. Moreover, there's an interesting case study when Ambassador Kovanda for the first time mentioned genocide relating to Rwanda. Because he didn't consider the consequences. The consequence is, if there is genocide, United Nations has to intervene. I mean, you have to intervene because this is something which is, undermining the basis, the moral basis of the order. That's why even Americans were avoiding it, because knowing that they would be obliged to intervene after Black Hawk Down and the Somalian, experience. This kind of desperation, it's not, it's about, bad things happening, and you have to stop them. It's your responsibility. Iraqi intervention, I would judge differently. I mean, that's a different case. We shouldn't put all these things into one basket. But definitely, the whole debate about humanitarian intervention, I think it's something we should engage in. Of course, we should listen to this realistic point of view that we should judge the consequences of our behavior, but it will be always the decision between two evils. I think it's not good solution to that. I think where we differ is I came throughout last 25 years to how to put it, acknowledgement of necessity of power behind the international institutions. There should be a power to actually to deter those who would like to break the order and to punish those who did it. I think without power, this is just on paper. And institutions, international organizations without power are not good for us. That's why we need a strong NATO and we need strong European Union so that we will not, it will be not necessary to call on Washington all the time. But we need power. I think to think that you can apply power of powerless on the state level, I think Havel never went that far to do this. So I think we have a different, view on using power and having power, because I think to have power is important. Power is an important part of international politics, and we have to take it. Yeah.
So it's not the difference between us.
Okay, well, so we are on the same boat. Now, very briefly to your question, my feeling is that there is a decreasing interest among political elites about foreign policy throughout the 25 years, it was visible after the first elections to the European Parliament, where those who really were interested in the national parliament about foreign policy were, you know, attracted to run for the European Parliament, and some of them went to European Parliament and were lost to the national debate about the foreign policy because they were dragged into new debates there. And unfortunately, our mainstream political parties are weaker and weaker. That's what we are now witnessing. So it was very, very difficult to engage political parties in a real debate like this. I think from my point of view, I used to be in political party in the beginning of 90s. And my judgment, I was asked recently about the 25 years, is that we failed in building institutions, in building political parties in this country. This is a failure. And we somewhat managed, even without the law about the civil service, to actually a little bit upgrade slowly, step by step, the civil service. I know the foreign service, so I can tell you there's been a lot done. But I'm not sure how successful we were in, especially concerning, I mean, Social Democrats, ODS, other newly built parties. I think my feeling is that this is a deficit of recent years, and this is a big challenge for us. And that's why I have this problem of, you know, talking about right-wing parties and left-wing parties. I mean, it's an empty debate to me because of this.
Thank you very much.
Just two remarks. First about left and right. I think that the value-oriented policy is an experience of left and right in the same time, but the balance between realism and idealism will be different, but not on the basis of left-right tension. It will be on the basis country by country. Let's say post-imperial countries will be more realistic, post-revolutionary countries like ours will be more idealistic. I try to touch this historical question. The different values will be also the real question. The perception of the Middle East, I don't want to touch again Russia, it is more or less the same, but perception of the Middle East is a good example. Is it just a question of social undevelopment, and is it the only problem we have there? Or maybe we have a little bit more sophisticated aspirations of those who are counterproductive, let's say, for this piece of the world, and more sophisticated ambitions related to pure power or more cultural, philosophical dominance in the region. So it will be different opinions about it. The other remark is about strong European Union. We, as Central Europeans, are very much in favor of strong European Union because we think, rightly, that Europeanization of our politics is a good guarantee for values as well, for democracy, rule of law, etc., etc. But I see one paradox in this. One of the most important legacy of 1989 in this part of Europe is freedom, democracy, right to self-determination, etc. At the moment, in European Union, questions about democracy and, let's say, input legitimacy of the European project or European integration is heard everywhere, but not in Central Europe. That's a paradoxical thing. This question is not raised by extremists, it is raised by Constitutional Court in Karlsruhe. And it is completely not understood by Central Europeans who are, as we are, as probably myself is, as we are so concentrated on this first part of the answer, that yes, Europe is the guarantee. But this is the guarantee, but also the challenge for this. Probably it's another panel next year.
Excellent, thank you very much. Břetislav, if we could ask you to take the last few minutes for summation of your views. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I have a few small comments. What Ivan Gabel asked to Jiří Schneider about our current stage of knowledge of foreign policy and interests. I'm a little bit optimistic when we look back to beginning of 90s, how many think tanks and academia institutions were involved in foreign policy issues, on security policy issues, I have to say that we have done a lot of work, and we are now absolutely comparable with, I mean, Czech Republic, with Poland and with Slovakia in that sense. So I think that there is some room to provide policymakers, if they want, that's maybe your question, if they know that they should want to learn something from independent places and experts on foreign policy. That's my short comment on that. I would like to summarize this panel, if I can. I believe that it's business I was asked to do. I have one feeling that if we are talking about values, we are all the time very close to principles. And principles and values make sense only if we have symbols. Symbols which represent these values and principles. All of our panelists, especially Pavel touched it, talking about Masaryk, Havel, they, and Klaus in case of realism, these people are that symbols we need to understand values. How I think about understanding the values, it's communication between rulers and citizens. If we don't have values represented by symbols, there is no chance to establish significant conception of foreign policy. I have a huge reservation towards calling American position as a hegemony power. We have all the time talks about it. I would express maybe American leadership. When you look back to 90s and early 21st century, we can see that in Central Europe, in Czech Republic, there were strong supporters of American policy. Why? From right side, from left side, from independent positions, because there was clear intention from US to be leader. If you aren't leader, nobody could follow you. And in case of our, let's say, modest position towards the US, it's from my perspective, it's a feeling or atmosphere in which we live after Barack Obama took office. Leading behind. Americans are the same as the rest of the world. So some kind of isolationism in thinking about our position, do business as usual. We should solve our troubles at home, and later we will look around. So that's my opinion, that maybe if we look back to radar issue and these kind of things, I think that many people invested a lot of time and energy into cooperation with the US in this transatlantic, building transatlantic ties. But after years, I can say that I don't see clear leadership towards Europe. Ideas which were presented here in Prague weren't accepted by French policymakers, for example, not only by others. That's my short comment how I understand decreasing Atlanticism, for example, here in Czech Republic. What I heard, and I think that you will agree with me, all of our speakers agree that it's very difficult to define values. Values are universal, in some case universal for us because we are Europeans, and current model of international relations, human rights, and so on is very close to core values which rooted somewhere here in ancient Greece and so on. So that's very easy for us to talk about values, even that we are not able to define them clearly. What we we are able to do is making division between interests and values if we have some representative who is very, how to say, narrow or too critical to some extent. It concerns President Klaus in case of European Union, or in case of Václav Havel to support American intentions in Kosovo and other places. So Jiří touched a very important part of our discussion, and that's the role of European Union and NATO. I very like your example with sailor and ship. That's maybe I'll be a little bit critical about Britain's conception of Czech foreign policy. Is the paper, is the conception which is done properly, perfectly after a review of our agenda, is better than to keep some few principles and values and help us. These principles could help us to maneuver our foreign policy and be part of our wider consensus through left to right political parties, between government and parliament, and so on. I'm not sure that better foreign policy is based on properly done conception which is written and agreed in parliament. That's my point of view concerning values, principles, symbols, and so on. And in that case, we are member European Union and North Atlantic Alliance, so we don't need another documents which will better maneuver our foreign policy. But it's debatable, of course. What's nice is that if I'm correct, nobody expressed opinion that there is necessity to make dichotomy between values and interests. If there is that dichotomy, it's very difficult and strange for countries in Central Europe, because it took us to power politics or to politics which is unpredictable, and it's very bad for long-term interests. So I think that I have no power or ability to make it better than speakers invited to this panel. So thank you for attention.
Thank you. So before we break for a 15-minute respite and reconvene sharply at 11:30, can I once again please invite everyone to give our thanks to the panel for a very, very insightful session. Thank you all.